The first man hit the floor before he understood he'd been moved. 1 second he was lunging, 260 pounds of him, all shoulder and bad intention, coming forward under those white lamps to put the young Chinese man on his back in front of everyone. The next second the floor came up and took him. No sound from the young man. No grunt, no war cry, nothing. Just a turn of the wrist, a half step that nobody in that packed room could have drawn for you afterward, and the big man was looking at the lights from the wrong side of the platform. And here's the thing you need to hold on to, because the whole story lives inside it. Bruce Lee didn't smile, didn't look at the crowd, didn't do the thing a younger, smaller man does when he's just dropped a giant, that quick, hungry glance around the room to see who watched. None of that. He stepped back, set his weight, and his eyes went, not to the man on the floor, but to the back of the room, to the door, to the 4 men standing along the wall who weren't sitting like the rest. Because by then he already knew. He knew what kind of night this really was. He knew the man on the floor was never the danger. He knew the danger was wearing a nice suit and smiling from the front row, and that it had taken him a few minutes too long to understand that the trap had already closed behind him when he walked through that door an hour earlier. They called it a friendly demonstration. It was an ambush dressed in good manners. I've been around fighting men my whole life. 30-some years on the mats, on hard floors, in rooms that smelled like sweat and liniment and other people's fear. I've been the big man who thought size was a sentence, and I've been the smaller one looking up at somebody who had 40 pounds on me, doing math I didn't like. So when I tell you what kind of trap this was, I'm not reading it off a page. My body knows the shape of it. The worst danger in a room is almost never the loudest man in it. The worst danger is the room itself, when the room has been built around you, seat by seat, for one purpose. And that's the question I want you sitting with tonight, all the way to the end. What does a man show? What does he actually show when he walks into a room built to break him, realizes it too late, and understands that every single person watching came to see him humiliated? Most men show their fear. Some show their rage. A few show nothing and lose anyway. Bruce Lee showed them something else. Something none of them came for. And the room that filled itself with men who wanted to watch him fall, that room ended the night quieter than a church, and not one of them could look him in the eye. Stick with me, because the real story isn't the man he put on the floor. The real story is the 4 men by the door, and the 5th man, the one who never stood up at all. It started, like a lot of bad nights start, with something that looked like an honor. A letter, heavy paper, the good kind, hand-delivered to the little school Bruce was running back then, a few mats, a few students, a storefront with the windows soaked over so nobody could stand on the sidewalk and steal the lessons for free. He was young in this telling. Not the man on the movie posters yet. Not the legend the whole world would carry around in its chest. Just a wiry, fast, sharp-tongued young teacher with a growing reputation and a growing list of older men who didn't like the reputation one bit. That's the part people forget about him now. Before the world loved him, a certain kind of man hated him. Hated that he was young. Hated that he was fast. Hated, most of all, that he'd been teaching his art to anyone who walked in the door. Any color, any background, anybody with the money and the will. To the old guard, that was close to a crime. You didn't open the door like that. You kept the art behind a wall, and you kept the wall high, and you decided who got to climb it. Bruce had taken a sledgehammer to that wall, and a lot of powerful, respected, well-dressed men had watched him do it and made quiet notes. The letter was from one of them. It was polite. It was, if anything, too polite, that careful, formal courtesy that older men use right before they do something to you. It invited the young teacher to a gathering of respected practitioners and patrons. An evening of demonstration. A chance, the letter said, to show his celebrated style to an audience that would appreciate it. To stand on a raised platform under good lights and demonstrate his skill to men of standing in the community. An honor. That's how it read. That's how it was meant to read. They say one of his older students read it over his shoulder and grinned and said something like, "They finally want to see you, Sifu. They want to see you." And here's the small, cold detail the records keep, the one that tells you Bruce was sharper than the men who built this thing ever gave him credit for. He didn't grin back. He read it twice. He set it down on the mat. And he was quiet for a moment, the way a man gets quiet when his stomach is telling him something his eyes haven't caught up to yet. Because something about the letter smelled wrong. Too much courtesy. Too much honor. Men who respect you don't need a whole paragraph to tell you so. And men who'd spent 2 years muttering that you were a disgrace to the tradition don't suddenly hand-deliver heavy paper inviting you to shine. He knew. Some part of him knew, right there on the mat, with his student grinning beside him. And he went anyway. That's the part one wants you to understand, because it changes everything about how you watch this night. He didn't walk into the trap blind. He walked in with his eyes half open, smelling the wrongness of it, and he went anyway, because to refuse was to hand them exactly what they wanted without firing a shot. To say no was to say, "I'm afraid of your room." And whatever else this young man was, he was not going to let a room full of his enemies write the story that the Chinese kid was too scared to show up. So he wrote back, polite as the letter. He'd be honored to attend. And somewhere across town, in a nicer building than the one Bruce taught in, a man in a good suit read the reply and folded it and smiled to himself. Because the hard part was done. The hard part is always getting them to walk in the door. After that, you just fill the seats. The hall sat in a part of the city Bruce didn't usually have reason to go. The records, what survived of them, the accounts passed down by men who were there, and a couple who wished they hadn't been, describe it as a kind of association hall. The sort of place these old societies kept for banquets, for meetings, for the ceremonies that bind a certain kind of community together. High ceiling, good wood, a balcony running along one side. And at the center of the room, freshly built for the occasion, a raised platform. A stage, really, though nobody called it that. Maybe 1.5 feet off the floor. Board still pale and new, the lacquer barely dry. So the whole thing gave off that sharp varnish smell that gets in the back of your throat. And the lamps. This is the detail every account agrees on, so I'll give it to you the way they gave it to me. They'd hung lamps over the platform. Hard ones. Bright ones. Far more light than a demonstration needs. The kind of light you put on a man when you want him seen. Every drop of sweat, every flinch, every flicker of doubt. It poured straight down onto those new boards, white and merciless, and it did something to the rest of the room. It made an island of the platform and turned everything beyond the edge of the light into shadow. A man standing up there could feel the crowd, hear the crowd. But the lamps were angled so he couldn't quite see the crowd, just shapes, suits, the wet shine of 100 pairs of eyes out past the glare. Now, I want you to think like a fighter for a second, because this is the first move of the trap, and almost nobody in that room understood it as a move. When you put a man under hard light, and you take his side of the room away, you've already started to beat him. You've cut off one of his senses. You've put him on display while keeping his enemies in the dark. Every animal that's ever been hunted knows this in its blood. The open ground, the bright sky, the thing watching you from the tall grass where you can't see it. The platform was the open ground. The lamps were the bright sky. And the men who built this knew exactly what they were doing when they hung them. The young master noticed the light the moment he walked in. They say he stopped, just inside the door, and looked up at it. A long beat. Reading it. A teacher of his caliber doesn't see lamps. He sees angles. He sees what's lit and what's hidden. He sees the geometry of a room the way you and I see whether it's raining. And what that light told him was simple and cold. This was not built to show me off. This was built to expose me. But it was the seats that said the rest. Because the hall was filling. And as Bruce moved through it, polite, contained, a slight man in simple clothes moving through a crowd of men in good suits, he read the seats the way he'd read the lamps. And the seats told a story the letter had lied about. There were no women. In a community gathering, an honor, a celebration, there'd be families, there'd be elders' wives, there'd be the whole texture of a real event. There were none. Every seat held a man. And not just any men. Hard men. Young, most of them, under the suits. You can dress a fighter in fine wool, but you can't hide the neck, the hands, the way he sits forward off the back of the chair like the chair's an inconvenience. Bruce had spent his whole short life around bodies that knew violence, and he was walking through a room full of them, all turned toward the platform, all waiting. A demonstration audience leans back. They've come to be impressed, to enjoy, to murmur and nod. This audience leaned forward. They'd come to feed. I've walked into a room like that. Once. A long time ago, and a long way from here. And I won't bore you with it, but I'll tell you the feeling, because Bruce felt the same one and his was 100 times worse. It's the feeling of every face turning the same direction, of being the only warm thing in a room full of cold. Your skin knows before your brain does. The hair on your arm stands up, and a small ancient voice in the base of your skull says one word, out. But there was no out. Not anymore. He was already on the island. The crowd was the water. And somewhere up at the front, a man in a very good suit was rising from his chair, beaming, arms spread wide in welcome, ready to play the gracious host in front of the room he'd built. The trap didn't slam. That's what people get wrong about traps. The good ones don't slam. The good ones close so softly you mistake the sound for applause. Let me give you the host, because you need to understand him, and I need to give him to you the right way, which is to say, without enjoying his downfall before we get to it. The accounts don't agree on his name, and I won't invent one for you, because that's not the part that matters. Call him what he was. The host. A man of standing in that community, money, lineage, a name that opened doors and closed them. Old enough to be Bruce's father. The kind of man who'd spent 30 years being deferred to, having younger men lower their eyes when he entered, watching the world arrange itself around his importance the way it had always arranged itself. And then this kid showed up. You have to understand what Bruce was to a man like that. Bruce wasn't a rival. A rival you can respect. Bruce was an insult. He was young where the host valued age. He was loud where the host valued silence. He was fast and brilliant and completely, gloriously indifferent to the wall the old men had spent their lives building and guarding, the wall around the art, around who could learn it, around who they were. Bruce taught anyone. And to the host, that wasn't generosity. That was a boy spitting on 300 years of careful tradition and getting praise for it, getting students, getting a name, getting respect that, in the host's accounting, belonged to men who'd earned it the slow way, the proper way, the closed-door way. I want to be straight with you about something, because the file I work from is honest, and so am I. There was a poison in this that went past tradition. You strip away the talk about lineage and respect and the proper way of things, and underneath it, with some of these men, was something uglier and simpler. A young Chinese teacher, gaining ground, gaining a name, refusing to stay where he was put, refusing to keep the art among their own and behind their wall. To a certain kind of man, of any background, in any era, there is nothing in this world more enraging than someone who will not accept the place you've assigned him. The host had assigned Bruce a place. Small, quiet, grateful, behind the wall. And Bruce kept walking right past it like it wasn't there. So the host did what that kind of man always does. He didn't challenge Bruce openly. That's not how he won things. He hosted. He arranged. He used his standing and his money and his good suit and his beautiful manners to build a room. He couldn't beat the young man himself, and he'd never lower himself to try. But he could fill a hall with men who wanted what he wanted. He could hang the lights. He could build the platform. He could write a letter so courteous it would shame the kid into showing up. And then he could sit in the front row in his fine clothes and watch the trap do the work his own hands would never deign to do. That's the thing about this kind of cruelty. It always wears gloves. It always smiles. It always calls itself something gentle, a demonstration, a friendly exhibition, an honor among practitioners. It hires other men's fists and other men's rage and keeps its own hands clean and folded in its lap. Ray's seen 100 of them, across 100 gyms and 100 years of the same human animal. The man who never throws a punch, but somehow there's always blood on the floor when he leaves. The one who whispers go on and show him and teach the boy a lesson, and then looks shocked, just shocked, when the boy ends up hurt. He didn't come to fight Bruce Lee. He came to watch. He came to feed, same as the rest, except he'd set the table. And when Bruce reached the front of the hall, the host took both his hands, both of them, warm two-handed, the politicians clasped, and welcomed him with a smile so wide and so genuine-looking that a lesser man would have relaxed. Bruce did not relax. The records keep this, and I love this detail, because it's the whole man in a single moment. The host smiled his enormous smile and held the young teacher's hands, and said how deeply honored everyone was that he'd come. And Bruce looked at him, calm, level, those dark eyes giving back nothing, and said, quietly, just for the two of them under all the noise and light, Thank you for the invitation. It's a very full room. That's all. It's a very full room. But you understand what he was saying. They both did. He was telling the host, I see it. I see all of it. I see the lamps and the seats and the hard men and the missing women and the new boards still wet with varnish. I know what this is. And I came anyway. The host's smile didn't move. But somewhere behind it, just for a half second, the records say something flickered. Because the host had built a trap for a frightened boy. And a frightened boy had not shown up. Now the host did the thing these men always do. He performed the lie out loud, in front of everyone, so that later, when it went wrong, there'd be 100 witnesses to swear it was all in good fun. He turned to the room, still holding Bruce loosely by the arm, and he raised his voice into that wide, gracious register, and he told them all what a privilege it was. A young master of rising fame. A celebrated teacher. Here, tonight, generous enough to share his art with them. And then, light, easy, a chuckle in it, he said they'd arranged a few of their own students to assist, to partner with the master, to give the demonstration some life. Nothing serious, of course. Nothing rough. Just a friendly demonstration. He must have used the word 3 times. Friendly. Friendly. Just friendly. The way you say a thing too many times only when it's a lie and you need it nailed down before the truth gets loose. And the room chuckled along with him. A low, ugly, knowing chuckle that ran through all those forward-leaning men in their good suits, because every one of them knew the word for the joke it was. Friendly. Sure. They'd come across the city, and put on their good clothes, and pack themselves into this hot, bright hall on a weeknight to watch something friendly. I want to stop right here, because this is the exact center of how this kind of trap works, and if you've ever been on the wrong end of one, at a job, in a family, in any room where the powerful decide to put someone in their place with a smile, you already know this in your bones. They never tell you it's a fight. If they told you it was a fight, you could fight. You could plant your feet, raise your hands, meet it honestly. A man can survive an honest fight. What breaks men is the friendly version. The one where if you defend yourself, you're the one who ruined the nice evening. Where if you take it seriously, you're the one who made it ugly. Where the rules are written so that flinching makes you a coward and fighting back makes you a brute, and the only role left for you to play is the one they cast you in. The outsider who didn't know his place, getting gently, regretfully, put back in it. That was the real trap. Not the platform. Not the lamps. Not even the hard men. The trap was the word. Friendly. If Bruce fought hard, he'd prove he was the savage they'd always said he was. If he held back to keep it friendly, he'd be dismantled in front of 100 enemies, and they'd call it a lesson. They'd built a box with no clean way out. When ugly, lose the man. Lose clean, lose the night. Either way the host gets his evening. Either way the boy learns his place. They say Bruce stood there in the white light, 1 foot already up on those pale new boards, and you could see him understand it. All of it. The whole architecture of the thing, snapping into place in his mind like a lock turning. The smell of the varnish. The heat of the lamps on the top of his head. 100 men leaning forward in the dark. And the host beside him, beaming, friendly, gesturing him up onto the stage they'd built for his humiliation. And here's where the anger comes in. I told you at the start this was a story that runs from rage to stillness, and this is where the rage lives. So let me give it to you true. He was angry. Of course he was angry. Any man would be. The records and the stories all carry it. A tightness, a heat, a thing behind the eyes. He'd smelled the wrongness in that letter days ago, and he'd come anyway out of pride. And now here it was, worse than he'd let himself imagine, a whole room of it, hot and bright and patient, waiting to watch him fall. And the man who'd built it was touching his arm. Smiling, calling it friendly. There's a kind of anger that's pure heat. It makes you fast and stupid. It makes you do exactly what the room is praying you'll do. Explode, lash out, prove the story they've already written about you. The host was counting on that anger. The whole night was engineered for that anger. Bait the young hothead, let the temper do the rest. And for a moment, the accounts agree on this, and I believe it, because he was a man and not a statue. For a moment, the heat had him. Then he stepped up onto the platform, into the full weight of the lamps, and something in him changed. Because Bruce Lee had spent his whole life learning one thing better than he'd learned anything else. Not how to punch, not how to kick, how to take the heat in his chest and turn it into something cold. How to be furious and still, at the same time, in the same body. The crowd saw a slight young man squinting up into hard light, alone on a stage, surrounded. What they were actually looking at, and not one of them knew it yet, was the most dangerous thing in that entire room. A furious man who had just gone completely calm. The host stepped back off the platform, down among his people, and lifted a hand. And from the shadows at the side of the hall, the first one came up onto the boards. He was big. That's the first thing every account agrees on, and it's the first thing that mattered. The man who climbed up onto those pale new boards was big enough that the platform creaked under him when he found his footing. Not fat, not soft, big the way a working man is big, shoulders that filled out the borrowed jacket they'd put him in, hands that hung at his sides like tools, a neck that ran straight down into the collar without bothering to narrow first. 6'3", maybe 6'4". 240 pounds, give or take. And across from him, in the merciless white of those lamps, stood a young Chinese teacher who weighed 138 pounds on a good day, with a wet towel around his shoulders. The crowd made a sound when the big man stepped up. Not a cheer. Something lower than that. A hum. The hum a room makes when it gets what it came for. Now I want you to think about this picture for a second, because the host had composed it like a painting. He'd put his money into the framing. The lamps had been hung to do exactly this, to wash out the small man and carve the big one. The boards were narrow enough that two men on them stood close. The angle of the light flattened Bruce and threw the big man's shadow long across the platform behind him, so he looked even bigger than he was. Every visual choice in that hall said one sentence to every man in those forward-leaning seats. Look how small he is. Look how outmatched. Watch what we're about to do to him. The host, down on the floor now, in the front row, made the introduction. He kept his voice light. He named the big man as a respected student of the community, a capable practitioner. He said the two of them would now exchange some techniques, in the spirit of friendly exchange, and he asked everyone to enjoy the demonstration. friendly exchange. He used the word again. He couldn't help himself. Some men, when they're winning, can't stop touching the win. The big man on the platform did not look like a man preparing for a friendly exchange. He'd been told something else, in some back room, by some man with the right kind of voice, and whatever he'd been told was sitting behind his eyes now, as he looked across the boards at Bruce. There was no warmth in that look. There wasn't even hatred, not really. Hatred would have been personal. This was something colder than hatred. This was a job. He'd been pointed at this small man the way you point a dog at a smaller dog and told to do what the job required. And now he was rolling his neck on those big shoulders, loosening up, making the little popping sounds that big men make when they're about to use their bodies for the thing their bodies are for. Bruce did not roll his neck. Bruce did not loosen up. Bruce did not make any sound at all. He stood. He breathed. He let his hands hang where his hands wanted to hang. And he watched. That's the thing the room was missing, in all of its planning. The host had built every part of this evening around what Bruce would do. Whether he'd come, whether he'd fight, whether he'd hold back, whether he'd lose his temper, whether he'd run. The whole geometry of the trap was a guess at his reactions. But Bruce, in those first long seconds on the boards, wasn't reacting to anything yet. He was reading. He was listening to the boards under his feet. He was clocking the angle of every lamp. He was counting bodies in the dark. And yes, the records and the stories agree, he was counting the 4 men by the wall, and the one near the back door, and the others scattered along the edges who weren't sitting like spectators sit. He was building a map. Every fighter who's lived long enough builds the map before he throws anything. The young ones swing first and look around after. The good ones look around so thoroughly that by the time they move, the move is already over. And in those quiet seconds, while the big man rolled his neck and the crowd hummed and the lamps poured down their hard white light, Bruce understood the rest of the trap. Because here is the thing that had been bothering him since he'd walked in, the thing he hadn't quite been able to name. It wasn't the size of the partner. He'd been across from big men his entire life. It wasn't the size of the crowd, either. He could feel the hostility, sure, but a hostile crowd is just weather. You fight under it the same way you fight under rain. It was the door. The records, every version of them, keep this detail, and it's the one that tells you Bruce was operating on a level the host had completely failed to account for. He noticed, sometime in those first long seconds on the platform, that the men along the back wall had quietly closed the door to the hall. Not loudly. Not in a way you'd see if you were a regular spectator looking at the stage. But Bruce wasn't looking at the stage. Bruce was looking at the room. And the door, the only door he'd come in through, the only door anyone could come in or out through, was now shut, and there was a man standing in front of it. Arms folded. Not watching the platform. Watching the room. You don't post a man at the door to keep people out of a demonstration. You post a man at the door to keep people in. That was the second click of the lock turning. The first had been the lamps and the seats. This was the second. And somewhere, very quietly, in some part of him that didn't need words, Bruce Lee understood that whatever was about to happen on this platform was not the whole event. The platform was the show. The platform was what they wanted his eyes on. The real plan lived somewhere else in this room, and the closed door was the edge of it. Across from him, The big man took a step forward, and the room, as one body, leaned in another inch. I'm going to slow this down now, because the next 30 seconds are the whole night condensed, and if I run them too fast you'll miss them the way most of that room missed them. The big man came forward. He didn't lunge. Not yet. He was a working fighter, not a brawler, and he came in the way he'd been taught. Weight low, lead hand up. That long reach he had caught back behind it, looking to close the distance and use his size the way size is meant to be used. To smother. To overwhelm. To turn a fight into a wrestling match where the smaller man can't breathe. Bruce didn't move. I want you to hold on to that, because it was the strangest thing in the hall, and the men who knew anything about fighting felt it before they understood it. When a big man comes forward, a small man moves. That's the rhythm of the world. Small men circle. Small men retreat. Small men buy time with their feet because their feet are the only currency they've got. That's the textbook, and every fighter in that audience had grown up on the textbook. Bruce did not move his feet. He let the big man eat the distance. He let him come. 2 steps. 3. Close enough now that the big man's lead hand was almost in Bruce's face, and the crowd took a breath, and the host in the front row let himself smile, because this was the moment. This was where the small man was supposed to break, to flinch, to backpedal off the edge of the boards and look ridiculous. And then Bruce moved 1 foot. 1 foot, maybe 4 inches, to the side, off the line. That's all. The big man's lead hand was already committed. The reach was already out. The weight was already shifting forward onto the front leg the way it has to when you're closing on a target. And the target wasn't there anymore. The target was 4 inches to the left, exactly where the big man's body couldn't follow without rebuilding itself from the floor up. And in that half second where the big man's brain was sending the signal adjust and his body was answering, I can't, not yet, Bruce did something so small that half the room would later swear he hadn't done anything at all. He touched the big man's wrist. That's all. A touch. 2 fingers along the inside of the wrist, just under the bone, light as a man checking a pulse. And then he turned his own hip. Not hard, not violent, just turned, the way a door turns on a hinge. And the big man's reach, his weight, his commitment, his 240 pounds of forward intention, all kept going. Right past him. Into the empty air where Bruce had been standing a half second ago. The big man stumbled. Just a step. He caught himself. He hadn't fallen. He hadn't been hit. Nothing dramatic had happened, and that was the worst part of it, because his body knew something his face hadn't admitted yet. His body knew it had just been moved. Not blocked. Not countered. Moved. Like a piece of furniture a stronger man had decided to slide out of the way without asking. He turned, slower than he wanted to, and he looked at Bruce. And Bruce was already back where he'd started. Same spot. Same stance. Same breathing. Hands still hanging where his hands wanted to hang. Like nothing had happened. Like the big man had walked through a doorway and arrived in the same room. The crowd was quiet. Not stunned quiet. Confused quiet. They hadn't seen what had happened, exactly. They'd seen the big man rush in. They'd seen him stumble out the other side. They hadn't seen any blow land, hadn't heard any contact, hadn't watched anyone fall. By the rules of the spectacle they'd come for, nothing had happened. And yet something had happened, and the part of the crowd that knew anything about fighting was sitting forward now, with the first real expression of the night on their faces, which was not hunger anymore. It was a question. The host's smile had locked. It hadn't fallen. He was too practiced for that, but it had stopped moving, and a smile that stops moving is a different animal entirely. He glanced, very fast, at the big man. The look said, "Do it again. Do it properly this time." The big man got the look. He always got the look. That's why he'd been chosen. He came in again. Harder this time. No more probing. He came in like he meant it, the way the host had told him to, the way every man at the back of the room was waiting for him to. Big driving step, lead hand snapping up to feint, the real shot, a heavy right hand from somewhere behind his shoulder, already loading. The kind of punch that ends evenings. The kind that, if it lands clean on a 138-pound man, doesn't just drop him, it changes him. Maybe forever. It didn't land. This time Bruce didn't even step. This time Bruce, and I'm telling you what the accounts describe, and you can choose to believe it or not, but the men who were closest swore to it for the rest of their lives, leaned a few inches at the waist, off the line of the punch, so close that the air the fist moved went past his cheek, and a man in the front row claimed afterward he saw Bruce's hair lift from it. And then, while the big man's weight was still committed to a punch that had finished traveling through empty space, Bruce's hand came up, not from any wind-up, not from any chamber, from wherever his hand had been hanging at his side, and his open palm pressed, just pressed, against the inside of the big man's elbow. That's all. A press, like you'd press an elevator button. And the big man's whole arm folded the wrong way at the joint. His shoulder followed his arm, his hips followed his shoulder, and his feet, which had been set for a hard right hand, were now set for nothing at all. His own momentum, redirected by an ounce of pressure at exactly the wrong place in the chain, took him the rest of the way. He went down. He didn't fly. He didn't sail across the stage. None of the cinematic nonsense. He just went down. The way a building goes down when somebody pulls the right pin. Knees first. Then a hand. Then the side of his face on those pale new boards, with the lamps glaring down and the varnish smell still in the air. 240 pounds folded onto fresh wood with a sound that wasn't loud at all, and that was somehow worse than if it had been. And Bruce was already back where he'd started. Same spot. Same stance. He hadn't even turned his shoulders. Now the room made a sound. Not the hum from before. Not a cheer. Something between a gasp and a swallow. The sound 100 men make when the story they came to watch is suddenly telling itself in a language they don't speak. The big man pushed himself up onto one elbow. He looked at his own hand on the boards like he'd never seen it before. Then he looked at Bruce. And there was a thing in his face, and I've seen this face on big men in gyms my whole life, and I'll never get tired of describing it. There was a thing in his face that was not fear, exactly, and not anger, exactly, but the slow, horrible understanding that the math he'd lived inside his entire life had just turned out to be wrong. That size was not a sentence. That reach was not a guarantee. That somewhere in the last 6 seconds, the small man across from him had quietly explained to his body without saying a word, that this fight was already over and had been over before it started. And in the front row, the host was no longer smiling. Here is where the trap should have ended. In a fair room, in any room that wasn't this one, the host would have stepped up, clapped his hands, declared the demonstration a great success, called it remarkable, called the big man a worthy partner, called the young master gifted beyond his years, and herded everyone toward whatever food and drink was waiting in the back. That's how friendly demonstrations end. With a smile and a story you tell later about the night you saw something special. That's not what happened. What happened is the host made a small gesture with his hand, 2 fingers, low near his hip, where most of the room couldn't see it, and from the side of the hall, a second man stepped up onto the boards. The crowd took a second to catch up to what they were watching. The first man hadn't left the platform yet. He was still on one knee, gathering himself, breathing hard. And here was another man stepping up onto the wood beside him, shrugging out of a jacket, rolling his shoulders. Younger than the first. Leaner. The kind of body you build doing one thing for 10,000 hours. His hands were taped, and let me stop right there, because that detail tells you everything. You don't tape your hands for a friendly demonstration. You tape your hands when you're planning to hit something hard for a while. The host's voice came up, light and gracious as ever, and he said something about how the young master clearly deserved a more worthy partner. He said it with that same smile. He said it like a compliment. But every man in the room with eyes in his head understood what he was actually saying. He was saying, the first one didn't work. Send the next. And if the next doesn't work, send the next after that. We have all night, and we have a lot of men. That was the third click of the lock. The first had been the lamps and the seats. The second had been the door. This was the third. They weren't going to let him leave the platform until he'd been broken on it. Not beaten on points. Not embarrassed. Broken. The math of the trap was simple. Send man after man, each fresher than the last, each instructed to push it harder than the one before, until the small man's body finally failed. Until he was hurt enough that the night could be called by its real name and nobody would mind. And here is the moment in the story where Bruce Lee stopped being a guest in that hall. The accounts describe a stillness coming over him that was different from the stillness before. The first stillness on the platform had been the stillness of a man reading a room. The second stillness, this one, with the second man stepping up and the first man still on the boards and the host still smiling, this was a stillness with weight in it. The accounts used different words for it. One old man, decades later, called it the stillness of a door closing. Another called it the moment the boy decided. I'll give you my own, because I've felt the edges of it on the mat a few times in my life, and I know the shape of it. It was the stillness of a man who has finished being polite. He did not say anything. He did not look at the host. He did not look at the crowd. He looked, for one long second, at the second man stepping up onto the boards, at the taped hands, at the set of the jaw, at the way the man wasn't quite meeting his eyes, because he'd been told what was supposed to happen here, and he was getting ready to deliver it. And then Bruce did something that nobody in the room expected, because nobody in the room had been watching the right things. He stepped forward, off his spot, toward the second man, closing the distance himself. You have to understand how strange that was. A smaller fighter never closes the distance on a bigger one. Never. Distance is the small man's only friend. To close it voluntarily is to throw away your shield. Every fighter in the audience saw him step forward and felt the wrongness of it in their chest. The host felt it too. You could see his eyebrows lift, just a hair, because this wasn't in the script. The script had Bruce backing up. The script had Bruce circling, defending, trying to survive. The script did not have the small Chinese teacher walking forward to meet the next man halfway across the boards. The second man's eyes went a little wide. He hadn't expected it either. He'd been told what to do against a retreating target. Nobody had told him what to do against one that came toward him. He swung anyway. Of course he did. He was a fighter, and a fighter under bright lights in a watching room is going to swing. A hard left hook, looping in, the kind of punch that's meant to end on the side of a man's jaw and put the night to bed. It meant nothing. Bruce had stepped inside it. Inside the arc of the hook, and close, so close that the second man's elbow went past his ear, and the rest of the punch wrapped harmlessly around the back of his head. And while the second man's body was still rotating with the force of a punch that had never landed, Bruce's right hand came up from his hip, slow, almost lazy, and the heel of it touched the second man under the jaw. Touched, not struck. The records all say the same thing here, in different words. There was no real impact. There was no real force. Anyone watching closely would later swear that what Bruce did to the second man was barely a push. But the second man's head went back, and his neck went back, and his weight went back, and his body, which had been spinning into a hook, was now spinning into nothing, with no foot under him to catch it, because the hook had taken his feet to the wrong place. He landed on his back. Hard. The boards jumped under him. The lamps overhead shivered on their wires. And the crowd, bro, listen to me, because this is the moment where the night turned, and you have to hear it the way the men in that hall heard it. The crowd did not make a sound. Not a hum. Not a gasp. Nothing. 100 men in good suits, leaning forward in the dark, watching two of their own fighters go down in under 30 seconds of total work, and the room had gone silent. The kind of silent where you can hear the lamps buzzing. The kind of silent where every man in the dark is suddenly very aware of his own breathing and the breathing of the man next to him. The host stood up. He hadn't meant to. You could see it in the way he did it. Too fast, not graceful, not the smooth practiced rise of a man in control of his evening. He stood up because his body had decided to stand up before his mind had caught up, and now he was on his feet in the front row with 100 men behind him watching him fail to know what to do next. He made the gesture again. 2 fingers, low at his hip. A third man stepped up onto the boards. This one was the biggest yet. I want to pause here and tell you something, because this is where most tellings of this story get it wrong, and I want you to have the right one. Most tellings of this story, from here on out, become a fight scene. They give you the third man and the fourth and however many came after, one by one, each going down in his own way, the small master cutting through a line of larger men like a man harvesting wheat. And it's a hell of a scene, I'll grant you. It plays beautifully in the imagination. You can almost score it. But it misses the actual story. The actual story is what Bruce was watching while he was doing it. Because here is what the accounts, the real ones, the careful ones, all keep. He was not watching the men on the platform. He was watching the room. Every time he moved, every time he stepped inside a punch or turned a wrist or pressed an elbow in a direction the elbow didn't want to go, his eyes, between exchanges, kept going back to the same places. The back wall, the closed door, the men along the edges, the host on his feet in the front row, the balcony running along the side of the hall where, the records say, 3 more men had quietly appeared during the second exchange and were now leaning on the rail, watching, not like spectators, but like men waiting for a signal. He was reading the real fight. The men on the boards were not the fight. The men on the boards were the show. They were what the host was using to keep Bruce occupied, busy, contained on a small lit island in the middle of the room, while the actual plan, whatever it was, and we're coming to it, moved into position around him in the dark. This is the thing the host had not understood about the young man he was trying to break. The host had built his trap for a fighter. Bruce was a fighter, sure. But Bruce was something the host's whole world view didn't have a slot for. Bruce was a thinker. A relentless, precise, paranoid thinker who treated every room as a problem with a solution, who never stopped doing the math even when his body was moving. The host had assumed that under enough pressure the kid's mind would shut off and his fists would take over. That's how fighters break. That's the whole basis of every ambush ever built. But Bruce's mind did not shut off under pressure. Bruce's mind sharpened under pressure. The harder the room squeezed him, the more clearly he saw the shape of it. And by the time the third man stepped up onto those pale new boards, Bruce had finished his map. He knew, by then, how many hostile bodies were in that hall, and roughly where each of them was standing. He knew which door was guarded, and which way it opened. He knew the host was the trigger, that whatever was coming, the host would signal it, and the signal would come from somewhere on or near his body. He knew the balcony was occupied, and that the men up there had a clean angle on the platform. He knew, in short, that he was standing in the middle of something far larger and far uglier than a humiliation. He was standing in the middle of a plan that, if it went the way it had been drawn up, was probably not going to let him walk out of this hall on his own feet at all. You have to sit with that for a second. Because the story we tell ourselves about that night, when we tell it as a fight, is that Bruce was defending his pride, his reputation, his honor, his art. The story the records actually carry is uglier and quieter than that. He was defending his life. He wasn't sure of it yet. He didn't have proof. He had a closed door, 4 men by the wall, 3 on the balcony, a host whose smile had locked, and a parade of fighters being sent up onto a platform to break him. He had a shape, not a confession, but every instinct in a body that had been hit, and had hit back for 1,000 hours was telling him the same thing, in the same low voice at the base of his skull. The men on the platform are not the danger. The men on the platform are the distraction. When the real thing comes, it will come from somewhere you are not looking. And so he kept not looking at it. That was the genius of what he did next, and most tellings miss it entirely. He fought the men on the boards the way the room expected him to fight, more or less. He handled them, he moved them, he put them down, but his attention, the real attention, the part of him that mattered, never settled on the platform at all. The men he was handling were almost an afterthought. He was handling them with the front of his mind. With the back of it, the part that was older and quieter, and didn't speak in words, he was watching the room around them, waiting for the moment the host's hand moved in a way that wasn't a signal for another fighter. He was waiting for the moment the real trap sprung. And while he waited, the third man came at him. The third man was the biggest of them, and he was also the first one who was angry. The first two had come up as workmen. A job. They'd been pointed and they'd gone. And when they'd gone down confused more than anything. Two big men trying to understand how the floor had found them. But the third man had watched the first two fall. And watching the first two fall had done something to him. He'd seen his own people put down by a man half their size in front of a room they'd come to win in. And so he climbed up onto those boards already hot, already humiliated by proxy, already swinging in his mind before his feet had even found the wood. Bruce saw at the instant the man stepped up, saw the heat in him. And here is the thing you have to understand about fighting an angry man versus a calm one. And Ray will tell you this for free. It cost him enough to learn it. An angry man is easier. Always. An angry man has handed you the keys to his own body. He's told you when he'll come, how hard, and roughly where. Rage is loud. Rage announces itself a full beat before it arrives. The calm ones are the dangerous ones, the patient ones, the ones who wait, and Bruce knew that better than any man alive, because Bruce was the calm one in that room, and he knew exactly how much trouble a calm man was. The third man rushed. No setup. No feint. Just 260 pounds of insulted pride coming straight across the boards with both hands, looking to grab, to smother, to drag the small man into the kind of close, ugly mauling where size finally gets to do its work and skill drowns under weight. And this is the exchange the whole world remembers, if it remembers any of it, because this is the one the man in the front row saw from 3 feet away and swore to until the day he died. Bruce let him come. Same as before. Let the distance close. Let the big hands reach. And at the last possible instant, the instant where a half second later those hands would have closed on his collar, Bruce dropped. Not back. Down. Straight down, knees bending, center of gravity falling through the floor, so that the big man's grab closed on the air where a man's shoulders had been a quarter second ago. And as the big man's own momentum carried his weight up and forward over the empty space, Bruce came up underneath it. Up from that low crouch, like a spring let go, with the heel of his palm leading, not a fist, the records are very clear, an open hand, and that open hand found the soft place under the big man's jaw and kept going up, carrying every ounce of the big man's forward weight and adding to it the full unfolding drive of a 138-pound body uncoiling from the floor. The big man left his feet. Both of them. For just a moment, in the hard white light, 260 pounds of fighter hung in the air with nothing under him, and then physics remembered him and put him down on his back so hard the lamps shivered on their wires, and a fine haze of dust came up off the new boards and hung glowing in the light. And Bruce was already turning away. That's the detail. That's the one that matters. He didn't watch the third man land. He didn't admire it. Before the big man had even finished hitting the boards, Bruce had turned his head away from the platform, away from the show, toward the front row. Toward the host. Because his hand had moved. This is the hinge of the whole night. So I'm going to slow all the way down and walk you through exactly what the records keep, because it's the moment Bruce had been waiting for from the second he'd walked through that door. While the third man was rushing, while every eye in that hall, every single one, was locked on the small man and the giant bearing down on him, the host, down in the front row, had reached inside his fine jacket. That's where the men around the edges were supposed to move. That was the signal. Not for another fighter. The fighters were finished. The fighters had failed. 3 of his best men were on their backs on the boards, and the friendly demonstration was a smoking ruin in front of the most important men in his community. The host had run out of show. And a man like the host, a man whose whole life is built on never being humiliated, a man who has just been humiliated more completely and more publicly than he has ever been in his life by a Chinese kid half his age, that man does not clap politely and serve the food. That man reaches inside his jacket. The accounts differ on what was in his hand, and I won't pretend to know for certain, so I'll give you what they give me. Some say a short club, the kind a man can carry against the body where a jacket hides it. Some say a knife. One old account, the one I tend to believe because it's the least dramatic and the most specific, says it was simply his hand closing around something inside the coat and beginning to draw, while at the same moment, the men along the back wall, the 4 of them, the ones who'd been watching the room and not the stage, came off the wall and started forward through the dark toward the platform. That was the real trap. Not the lamps, not the seats, not the parade of fighters. All of that had been the show, the thing to keep Bruce busy and lit and surrounded while the host waited for the moment the kid was tired, or hurt, or just turned the wrong way. And when the fighters failed and the moment came and went, and the kid was somehow still standing untouched on those boards, the host did the thing these men always do when the polite version fails. He reached for the ugly version. The men by the wall were moving. The men on the balcony had come off the rail. The host's hand was inside his coat, and every face in that hall was still pointed at the third man hitting the floor. Every face except one. Bruce was already looking at the host's hand. Here is what nobody in that room understood, and what the host understood far too late. Bruce had not been fighting the men on the platform. He'd been positioning himself with them. Every exchange, every step inside a punch, every turn of a wrist, every drop and rise, had moved him, a foot here, 2 feet there, around that small lit island of a stage. To the room it looked like the chaos of combat, a small man scrambling and countering. It was not chaos. It was the most disciplined thing in the hall. With each man he handled, Bruce had quietly walked himself to the one spot on that platform he wanted to be standing on when the real thing came. The edge. The front edge. The edge nearest the host's chair. So that when the host's hand came out of that jacket, the distance between them, the distance everyone in the room assumed was the safe, formal, ceremonial distance between a performer on a stage and a patron in the front row, was a distance Bruce Lee could cross in less time than it takes to say it. And he crossed it. The records describe it, the ones that describe it at all, as a kind of disappearance. One instant the small man was on the boards, turning from the third man's fall. The next instant he was not on the boards. He was down off the front edge, in the front row, in the host's space, inside the host's reach, close enough to share his breath, and the host's hand, the hand that had been coming out of the jacket with whatever was in it, was no longer the host's hand to command. Bruce had it. Both of Bruce's hands had it. One on the wrist, one on the fingers, and the thing inside the coat, club, knife, whatever it was, stayed inside the coat, pinned there useless, by a grip the host could not begin to break. Nobody moved. The men coming forward from the wall stopped. They stopped because the whole shape of the thing had inverted in a single second, and their bodies understood it before their minds did. They had been moving in to help their patron finish a cornered boy. And now the boy was not cornered. Now the boy was standing in the front row with their patron's weapon hand locked in his grip and their patron's throat 8 inches from his free hand, and every one of them understood, in the cold animal part of the brain that does this math faster than thought, that if any of them took one more step, the small man would finish the host before they crossed the floor. That was the turn, bro. That was the thing none of them came for. The whole room had been built around a single story. The outsider, isolated and exposed, broken slowly under the lights by bigger and bigger men until there was nothing left of him to respect. And Bruce had taken that story, and without raising his voice, without a single wasted motion, he had turned it completely inside out. He was no longer the man on the island. The host was. The most powerful man in that hall, the man who'd built every inch of the trap, was now the one isolated and exposed, held, controlled, one slip of a young man's hand away from the end of everything, in front of every important man he knew. And here is where the rage could have won. I told you at the start that this story runs from rage to stillness, and I told you the rage lived in the middle, when Bruce understood the trap. Well, this is the place where the rage came back for its last try. Because Bruce Lee was a man, not a saint, and he was standing there with absolute proof in his 2 hands that this man had not come to humiliate him. This man had come to hurt him, maybe to end him, and had dressed it up as an honor and a friendly demonstration and a courteous letter on heavy paper. He had the proof. He had the man. He had the throat 8 inches away, and every reason in the world, and a body that knew exactly, how to close that 8 inches, and how little it would take. Every man in that hall expected him to do it. The ones who hated him expected it because it would prove everything they'd said. The savage outsider, the animal, see what he is. And maybe a few who'd started, in the last 60 seconds, to grudgingly respect him, maybe even they expected it, because it would have been fair. The host had earned it. By every law of the room, and the night, and the blood, the host had earned whatever the young man's free hand wanted to give him. The room held its breath, and waited for the small man to finish it. And the small man went still. He did not strike the host. He stood there, in the front row, in the white spill of the lamps, with the most dangerous man in the city's hand locked in his grip, and that man's throat undefended in front of him, and he did nothing. He held. He breathed. And he let the silence do the thing that no blow he could have thrown would ever have done. You have to understand what was happening in the host's body in those seconds, because this is the real defeat. This is the only defeat that ever actually mattered. The host was waiting to be hit. Every cell of him was braced for the blow. He'd thrown enough men to the wolves in his life to know exactly what came next when you ended up in the wolf's mouth, and he was waiting for it, flinching ahead of it, his whole body curled inward around the coming pain, in front of his entire community. The most respected man in the hall, visibly, helplessly, waiting to be struck by a boy. and the blow never came. That was the thing none of them came for. That was the thing the host could not survive. Bruce understood something about that man that the man did not understand about himself. That to strike him would have been mercy. A blow would have made the host a victim. A blow would have given him a wound to nurse, a story to tell, an injustice to point at. Look what the animal did to me. A blow would have let him off. The stillness gave him nothing to hide behind. Bruce held him there, in front of everyone, long enough, and the accounts say it was only a few seconds, but that those few seconds stretched out like an hour, long enough for every man in that hall to see it completely, to see that the boy could. To see that the boy chose not to. To see that the difference between the man on the platform and the man in the chair was not size, was not lineage, was not the wall the old men had built around the art. The difference was this: one of them, given total power over the other, used it to stop. And the other one, given a young teacher who'd done nothing but show up when he was invited, had spent 100 men and $1,000 and every shred of his honor trying to destroy him. And then, into that silence, Bruce spoke. Once. Quietly. Just for the host. But the room was so silent that the men in the first several rows heard it, and they carried it out of that hall and repeated it for the rest of their lives. And that is the only reason we have it now. He said, "You wanted them to see me fall." That's all. Not a threat. Not a curse. A simple statement, almost gentle, the way you'd tell a man a true thing he already knew. "You wanted them to see me fall." And then he opened his hands. He let the host's wrist go. He let the fingers go. He stepped back, up onto the edge of the boards, back into the light, deliberate, unhurried, giving the man room. He left the thing in the host's jacket exactly where it was, undrawn, the host's own choice now whether to finish what he'd started in front of all these watching eyes, or to let his hand fall empty to his side. The host's hand fell empty to his side. Of course it did, because the men by the wall had stopped. The men on the balcony had stopped. And every one of them, every hard man the host had hired and arranged and positioned in the dark, was now looking at their patron with the one thing in their faces that a man like the host cannot live in front of. Not fear. Not anger. Contempt. They'd watched him reach into his jacket. They'd watched the boy stop his hand. They'd watched the boy choose not to finish him, and they'd watched the host flinch, curled and waiting to be hit, in front of every man whose respect was the only thing he truly owned. The fighters on the boards, he could have survived. He could have spawned those into a story. But you cannot spin the moment the whole room watched you reach for a weapon against an unarmed guest you'd invited, and then watch that guest show you more honor in 3 seconds than you'd shown anyone in 30 years. The room had come to watch the outsider fall. It watched the host fall instead. And the worst part, the part the host would carry to his grave, was that nobody pushed him. He fell entirely on his own, in the 1 second of silence where a young man chose not to. Bruce did not say anything else. He didn't address the room. He didn't make a speech. He didn't claim the victory that was so completely his that no man in that hall would ever have dared deny it. He stepped down off the front edge of the platform, past the host, who did not look up, who could not look up, and he started across the floor toward the door. The guarded door. And this is the last beat of the night, and it's a small one. And it's the one I love most, because it tells you that everyone in that hall finally understood exactly what they just watched. The man at the door, the hard man who'd been posted there all night, arms folded, the one whose whole job was to make sure the boy didn't leave. That man stepped aside before Bruce reached him. Nobody told him to. The host certainly didn't. The host wasn't telling anyone anything anymore. The man at the door stepped aside on his own, the way you step aside for something you've decided not to be in the way of. And he opened the door, and he held it. Bruce stopped in the doorway, just for a second. He looked back at the room, the 100 men in their good suits, the 3 fighters still gathering themselves on the boards, the host alone and small in his front row chair under all that hard white light he'd hung to expose someone else. He didn't say you lost. He didn't say never again. He didn't say anything. He just looked. Long enough. The way a man looks at a thing he's finished with. And then he walked out into the night, and the door closed behind him, and the lamps went on buzzing over an empty platform in a room that had come to watch a man fall and had gotten exactly what it asked for, just not the man it expected. They say nobody touched the food. They say the men filed out, quiet, not looking at each other, the way men leave a place where they've seen something about themselves they'd rather not have seen. They say the host sat in that front row chair a long time after the hall had emptied, under the lamps, alone. And they say, this is the part one can't prove, but I'll give it to you because every version keeps it, and some things survive because they're true. They say that for the rest of his life, the host never spoke of that night. Not once. Not to defend himself, not to lie about it, not to spin it into a story where he came out whole. He simply never spoke of it. Which, for a man whose entire life was the stories other men told about him, was its own kind of ending. The third man came onto the boards with a different kind of weight. The first 2 had come up as fighters. This one came up as a problem. He was the biggest yet, but it wasn't the size that mattered. It was the way he carried it. Loose. Heavy in the hips. The shuffle of a man who'd been hit a lot in his life and was still standing, which is its own kind of resume. His knuckles were thick the way knuckles get thick from years of contact with things harder than knuckles. He didn't look at Bruce when he stepped up. He looked at the host. That's the tell. Remember that? A fighter who's truly there to fight looks at the man across from him. A fighter who's there to do a job looks at the man paying him. The host gave a small nod. Not the kind he'd been giving. A different nod. Lower on the chin. More private. And the third man, instead of squaring up on the platform the way the first 2 had, circled. He moved out toward Bruce's left, slow, taking the long way around to the center of the boards. He wasn't getting into a fighting stance. He was getting into a position. He was putting his body somewhere specific, relative to something in the room. Bruce saw it. I want you to understand what he saw, because the records carry it precisely, and it's the moment the story stops being a fight and becomes something else. The third man wasn't lining up to attack Bruce. He was lining up to put himself between Bruce and the door. The platform was small. The boards were narrow. You had to step off the platform in one of 4 directions: front, back, left, right. The closed door of the hall was off the back left corner. The first 2 men had come straight up the front. The third man was now standing on the back left of the platform with his weight set, his hands loose, his eyes on the host. He was not a partner. He was a plug. He was there to keep Bruce on the boards. And in that half second of reading him, Bruce understood the entire shape of the rest of the night. The men on the platform were never going to end this. The men on the platform were timers. Each one bought the host a minute, maybe two. The host was running out the clock on something. Something was being moved into position, somewhere in this hall, that needed time to get ready, and the parade of fighters on the boards was buying that time. Whatever was coming next was the actual evening. Whatever was coming next was the reason the door was closed, and the balcony was full, and the seats had no women in them. And here is where I'm going to break my own rule and sit inside the man for one moment, because the rest of this story doesn't work unless you feel what he felt. He was alone. Bro, listen. I've stood in rooms where I didn't like the math, and I've never stood in one like this. 100-some men. None of them on his side. The only door guarded. The lights on him. A fighter in front of him, a fighter behind him, a balcony of men above him. And in his own chest, somewhere under the calm, because the calm was real, the calm was the only thing keeping him standing. Somewhere under it was a young man, 20-something years old, who understood with absolute clarity that he had walked into a building that had been built around him, and that the building did not intend to let him walk back out. That is the moment in this story, not the punches. That, the moment a young man, alone, under hard lights, in a room full of people who hate him, decides what kind of man he is going to be for the next 10 minutes. He could have begged. Some men would. He could have exploded. Some men would, and the room was praying for it. He could have tried to run for the door, and the men at the door, and the 4 along the wall, and the 3 on the balcony would have given the host exactly the ending the host had paid for. Bruce did none of those things. What Bruce did, the records say, was turn his head, slowly, calmly, no rush in it at all, and look directly at the host in the front row. For the first time all night. He did not speak. He did not point. He did not threaten. He just looked at him. Held him. The way you hold a man with your eyes when you want him to understand something specific without any room for misunderstanding. And what Bruce was saying to him with that look, across the heads of all those forward-leaning men, was very simple. I see you. I see all of it. I know what this is. And you and I both know that whatever happens on these boards in the next 2 minutes, you are the one who is going to have to live with. The host's eyes broke first. It was small. A man in the 3rd row probably didn't catch it. But the host's eyes flicked down, off Bruce, onto his own hands, and then back up. And when they came back up, the smile was gone. Not replaced with anger. Not replaced with anything. The face under the smile was thinner than the smile had been. Smaller. A man who had built a room to watch another man be broken, and was now starting to understand, in some part of himself he didn't usually visit, that the man on the boards was not breaking. And then the 3rd man came forward. He came clean and hard, no feint, the way a man comes when he's been told don't bother making it look like sparring, just put him down. A driving over him right, weight behind it, aiming for the side of Bruce's head. The kind of punch that's not really a punch. It's a closing move. It's a punch you throw to finish, not to start. Bruce did not catch it. Bruce did not block it. Bruce did not slip it the clever way he'd slipped the first two. Bruce stepped into him. Not around. Into. He took one short step, dropped his weight a half-inch, and his shoulder went into the third man's chest at exactly the wrong moment in the man's punch, that fractional instant when the weight has committed forward but the back foot hasn't caught up yet. The overhand right went over the top of Bruce's head and finished in the air. The third man's chest went into Bruce's shoulder. And Bruce's hands, both of them, came up under the third man's arms, found the points he was looking for, one at the soft place just below the collarbone, one at the bend of the elbow, and lifted. That's the word the accounts use. Lifted. He didn't throw him. He lifted him. Took his weight, the whole 250+ pounds of it, and redirected it up, and then, in the same motion, back. Off the line. Toward the back left corner of the platform. Toward the spot the third man had so carefully chosen to plant himself a minute ago. Off the edge of the boards. The third man went off the platform backward, arms wheeling, and the spot he'd been guarding, the path to the door, was suddenly empty. The host stood up. This time he stood up the way you stand up when something has gone wrong that you can't fix from your seat. Fast. Loud. The chair scraping. And the host's hand came up, and this time it didn't make the small two-finger signal. This time it made a different signal. A whole hand, open, raised high, a movement big enough to be seen from the back of the hall and from the balcony. It was the signal Bruce had been waiting for all night. The signal that meant, enough of the fighters. Bring the rest. And from the four corners of the hall, the rest started to move. This is the turn. I told you at the start of this story that the real threat that night was never the man in the ring. I told you the platform was the show. I told you to remember the four men by the door and the fifth man who never stood up at all. We're here now. We're in it. Because when the host raised his open hand, the room changed. The four men along the back wall pushed off the wall. The three men on the balcony came off the rail. The man at the door turned the small bolt at the top and slid it home, a sound everyone in the front 3 rows heard, a small dry metallic click that did not belong at a friendly demonstration. And from a side door nobody had been watching, a service door, maybe a kitchen door, the kind of door a hall like this has tucked away for staff, 2 more men stepped out into the back of the room. They had not been in any of the seats. They had not been in any of the accounts of who was supposed to be there that night. They were dressed differently from the suited men. Plainer. Heavier coats, even though the hall was hot. The kind of coats men wear when they need pockets, and the pockets need to hide things shaped like things. That was the real plan. Not a humiliation. Not a beating, even. Removal. The fighters on the platform had been buying time for the rest of the room to get into position. The host had no intention of letting the young teacher leave that hall as a man with a story to tell. The story he planned was a different one. A story where a celebrated young master had unfortunately had an incident at a private gathering, where things had gotten out of hand, where the details were unclear, where the only witnesses were 100 respected men who would all, regrettably, remember it the same way. That's the thing about a room full of your enemies. They don't just hurt you. They get to write what happened. And Bruce, standing alone on the boards, the third man off the platform behind him, the lamp still pouring down, Bruce had read all of this 15 minutes before any of it moved. He had spent the entire night looking like a man defending himself on a stage. He had actually been a man memorizing a room. He stepped down off the platform. Listen to that. That's the moment. Not a punch, not a throw, a step. Off the boards. Down onto the floor of the hall. Into the same dimension as the rest of the men in that room. Off the island, into the water. He did it before any of them got into final position. He did it while they were still moving. He did it because the platform had been their stage, and he was done playing the part the stage had been built for. The men who'd come off the wall stopped, just for a half second. The men on the balcony stopped at the top of the stairs. Even the two from the side door slowed. None of them had been told what to do if the young teacher came down off the platform on his own. The plan had assumed he'd stay up there, fighting fighter after fighter, until the rest of the room could close around the boards from all sides. The plan had not accounted for him walking off. He didn't go for the door. That's the other thing. Every man in that hall, in the second after he stepped down, expected him to bolt for the door. The bolted door. The guarded door. The door that would have ended him, because the man in front of it had been waiting for exactly that, a panicked smaller man running, head down, easy. Bruce did not run for the door. Bruce walked, calmly, 2 paces toward the host. The host was still standing in the front row. His hand was still half raised from the signal. And now there was a slight man walking toward him. No rush in it. No anger you could see, the lamps behind him so that the host had to look slightly up into the light to meet his eyes. The 4 men from the back wall started to move again, fast this time. They were maybe 30 feet away. Bruce reached the host before they covered 10 of those feet. He did not touch him. I want to be very specific about that, because the legend likes to dress this moment up, and the truth is leaner and better than the legend. He did not grab the host. He did not strike the host. He did not put a hand on him at all. He stopped 1 short pace away, and he spoke. Quietly. Just to the host. But the room was so silent by then, the kind of silence a room falls into when it understands something has slipped out of the script, that the front 3 rows heard him clearly, and the men in the front 3 rows carried it the rest of their lives. He said, "Tell them to stop." That was it. 4 words. No threat in them. No fury. Just a sentence said quietly to a man in a fine suit who'd built a hall to have him killed in. The host did not answer. The host's mouth opened very slightly. The host's eyes went past Bruce to the men coming across the floor and back. He was doing the math any man does in that moment. The math of, if I let them keep coming, what happens? If I stop them, what happens? Which version do I live with? The 4 men were 10 feet away now. 8. Bruce did not turn to look at them. He kept his eyes on the host. He let the host feel them coming up behind him. He let the host be the one to decide. "Tell them to stop." He said it again. Same tone. Same 4 words. And the host, the man who had built the room, hung the lamps, written the letter, filled the seats, hired the fighters, sealed the door, the host raised his hand. The same open hand. And he held it up, palm out, toward his own men. Stop." They stopped, mid-stride. One of them so close I could have reached out and touched his sleeve if I'd been Bruce, and the records say Bruce did not even turn his head to confirm it. He knew. He'd heard the steps stop. He knew the room. He'd been mapping it for 40 minutes. He held the host's eyes a beat longer. Then he said one more thing. The accounts disagree slightly on the wording. Some have it longer, some shorter, but they agree on the meaning, and I'll give it to you in the version that sounds most like the man. "I came when you invited me. Now I'm going to leave. You're going to let me. And then you and I are never going to be in the same room again." The host did not speak. The host nodded very slightly. Once. Bruce turned. He did not hurry. He walked through the gap between two of the men who'd been coming for him, close enough that one of them later said he could smell the lacquer from the platform on his clothes, and he walked the length of that silent hall, past every forward-leaning man in his good suit, past the men on the balcony with their hands gripping the rail, past the two men in the heavy coats by the side door. And he reached the front door. The man at the door looked at the host. The host nodded again. Same small nod. The bolt slid back. The door opened. And Bruce Lee walked out into the night air alone, without having struck a single man on that floor in anger, leaving behind him a hall full of men who had come to watch him fall, and had instead watched something none of them had words for yet. I want to stay in that hall for one more minute, because what happened in the hall after he left is part of the story, and most telling skip it. Nobody clapped. That's the first thing. 100-some men, the door just closed behind the small Chinese teacher, and not one of them clapped. Not in mockery, not in respect, not at all. The hall stayed silent the way the platform had gone silent after the second man went down. Only this silence had 100 bodies in it instead of a fighter on his back, and it weighed more. The host sat down. He sat down slowly. His knees did the work his face wasn't ready to do yet. He sat down in his front row seat in his fine suit, and he put both his hands flat on his thighs, palms down, and he looked at his hands instead of at any of the men around him. Because every man around him was looking at him. He could feel it. 100 pairs of eyes that had come to watch a small man humiliated were now resting, instead, on the host who had failed to deliver the night he'd promised them. That's the thing about a room you fill with your enemy's enemies. They are not your friends. They are with you only as long as you give them what they came for. And the host had not given them what they came for. He had given them, instead, a memory none of them wanted to carry, of a young man walking out of their hall without permission, after looking each of them in the face on his way past. The men on the platform, the 3 who'd gone down, had to get themselves off the boards. Nobody helped them. The first man rolled onto his side and sat up and stared at the wood for a long time before he stood. The second man's jaw worked, but no sound came out of it. The third man, the big one who'd been the plug, never quite stood up straight. Something in his shoulder, the accounts say, didn't work right for the rest of his life. None of that happened with cruelty. Bruce had not been cruel to any of them. They had simply met an instrument that was tuned to a frequency their bodies did not know how to receive, and their bodies remembered. The men along the back wall drifted back to the wall. The men on the balcony drifted away from the rail. The two men in the heavy coats, with their heavy pockets, slipped back through the side door they'd come from, and were never identified in any account that I've ever been able to find. And somewhere in the next 10 or 15 minutes, in ones and twos, the audience began to leave. Not together. Not in any kind of formal ending. There was no closing speech. The host did not stand up again. People simply, quietly, took their coats and walked out the front door, the door that, a half hour earlier, had been bolted against a man getting out, and they went home, into their own nights, carrying a memory they did not yet know how to tell anyone about. A lot of them never did tell it. That's the thing about the records of that night. They're thin. They're scattered. They survive in pieces, in a sentence dropped years later by a man who'd been in row 4, in a deathbed admission from a man who'd been on the balcony, in a story told once by a fighter whose shoulder didn't work right anymore. The hall full of witnesses produced almost no witnesses, because to admit you'd been there was to admit what you'd come for. And almost none of those men, in the rest of their lives, were willing to be the kind of man who'd come for that. That's the first cost of that night, and the host paid it. He'd assembled a room of men who would never again look at him quite the same way. The standing he'd spent 30 years building, he'd burned in 40 minutes, and the only person who'd actually thrown anything in that hall was a young teacher who hadn't thrown a single closed fist. Outside, the records say, the air was cold. Bruce walked. Not fast. He didn't look back at the hall. He didn't celebrate, didn't shake, didn't do any of the things a man does when he's just walked out of something he wasn't sure he was walking out of. The accounts of the people who saw him in the hour after, a couple of students, the man who ran a small noodle place where he stopped, all described the same Bruce. Quiet, calm, tired in the eyes in a way that wasn't the tired of a fight. The tired of having been right about something he'd hoped he was wrong about. One of his students asked him, that night, what had happened. Bruce thought about it. He took his time. He was a young man who had just learned something important about the world, and he was looking for the right way to set it down. And what he finally said, the line the student carried for the rest of his life, the line that got passed quietly from teacher to teacher in that small school for years after, was this. They built a room to make me small, so I made myself quiet. The room did the rest. That's the whole story in one sentence. And it's why I told you, at the start, that the room ended the night quieter than a church. The room had been built to make a small man smaller. Instead, it had been the room that shrank. There's a thing fighters know that civilians don't, and I want to give it to you before we get to what happened to the host in the years after. When you've been in a real moment, not a sparring round, not a tournament, an actual moment where the math wasn't sure, you don't walk out of it the same man who walked in. You walk out carrying something. Sometimes it's pride. Sometimes it's shame. Mostly, if you've lived long enough, it's a kind of weight you didn't have before. A quiet knowing in the chest of what you're capable of, and what you're not, and what the world is capable of doing to you on a Tuesday night for no reason you ever fully understand. Bruce walked out of that hall carrying something specific. Not the pride of having handled 3 fighters in front of 100 men. The accounts are unanimous that he never bragged about that night. Not once. He didn't tell it as a victory story. He didn't tell it as a fight story. For most of his short life, he barely told it at all. The students who knew it because they'd been there in the days after, and they'd watched him work something out in himself that wasn't a technique. What he carried out was the understanding that the trap was the lesson, not the fighters, not the punches, the trap. He had spent his whole young career believing that the worst thing you could face in this world was a bigger man with bad intentions. And in that hall, in 40 minutes, he had learned a different curriculum. He had learned that the worst thing you could face in this world was a room built by men with money and patience and standing, who had decided that you were not going to be permitted to exist the way you decided to exist. He had learned that the dangerous man in a room is almost never the loud one on the platform. He had learned that the dangerous man is the quiet one in the front row in the good suit, who never throws a punch, and somehow there's blood on the floor when he leaves. And he had learned, and this is the part that shows up in the rest of his life, in the choices he made, in the way he taught, in the way he refused, over and over again, to bend back behind anyone's wall. He had learned that the only way out of a room like that is to refuse, completely, to play the part the room has cast you in. The host had cast him as a frightened boy. He had refused that part. The host had cast him as a brute. He had refused that part. The host had cast him as a victim. He had refused that part. The host had cast him as a corpse. He had, very specifically, refused that part. What he'd given the room, instead, was a part the host hadn't written and didn't have a name for. A man who had walked through their evening without playing any of the roles they'd brought him there to play, and had walked back out the front door under his own power because of it. That is the thing he carried out of that hall into the rest of his life, and in a way, into ours. Because every student he had after that night was taught, somewhere in the curriculum, the lesson he'd learned in that room, even when he didn't say the lesson out loud. The lesson was the way he taught them to move in a space. The lesson was the way he taught them to look, not at one man across from them, but at the whole room, all the time, all four corners, the doors, the windows, the people who weren't moving and the people who were. The lesson was the way he taught them that the punch is never the danger. The danger is the architecture around the punch. The danger is the room. A lot of fighters in the decades since have learned to throw something close to what Bruce Lee threw. Very few of them ever learned to see what Bruce Lee saw. That's the inheritance. That's what came out of that hall in the cold air with him, and what he carried for the rest of his short life, and what he handed down to the few students who were ready for it, and threw them to the rest of us in pieces, in stories like this one. The host went home that night too. But the host did not carry anything out. The host had left everything in that hall, and the hall, in the years to come, was going to give it back to him in installments, slowly, on a schedule he did not get to set. Which is the next part of the story. The host did not die that night. That would have been a different kind of story, and a cleaner one, and life is almost never clean. He went home. He took off the fine suit. He sat in whatever room he sat in the kind of house a man with his standing kept in those years, and he went to bed. And in the morning he woke up, and he was, on paper, the same man he had been the morning before. Same money, same name, same business, same lineage. The hall was still his. The community still, technically, owed him the deference it had always owed him. And underneath all of that, something had moved. You have to understand the world he lived in, because if you don't, The next part won't make sense. He lived in a world that ran on respect, not affection, not love. Respect, the kind that gets you a table without a reservation, a price without an argument, a nod from younger men when you walk into a room. The kind you spend a lifetime building, and that, the men who have it will tell you, can be undone in an evening. His had been undone in an evening. It started small. The accounts of what came after are quieter than the accounts of the hall itself, because they were spread over years, and most of them are the kind of detail you only notice if you're looking for it. A man who used to call him sir started calling him by his first name, and then, after a while, stopped calling him at all. An invitation to a wedding he would have received automatically didn't come. A business deal that should have closed didn't close, and the man who didn't close it would not, when asked, say exactly why. It wasn't a boycott. Nothing so organized. It was 100 small withdrawals, by 100 different men, each of whom had been in that hall on that night, and each of whom had walked out of it carrying a memory they did not want to think about, and a quiet, private decision that the man who had given them that memory was no longer a man they wanted to be associated with. Not because he'd been cruel. They were not, most of them, men who minded cruelty. Because he failed. That's the colder truth of it, and I'm going to give it to you straight, because the file I work from is honest, and so am I. The men in that hall did not turn away from the host because he tried to have a young teacher killed in front of him. They turned away from him because he tried, with every advantage in the world, the money, the room, the lamps, the fighters, the sealed door, the men in the heavy coats, and he had not been able to do it. He had promised them a night where the natural order got restored, where the loud young outsider got put back behind the wall, and instead, they had watched the outsider walk out the front door under his own power, looking each of them in the face on the way. And a man who promises you the natural order and delivers you that man has shown you something about himself you can't unsee. He has shown you that his power was a story, and the story didn't hold. In a world that runs on respect, the unforgivable thing is not to be bad. The unforgivable thing is to be revealed. So they revealed him, slowly to himself, one unreturned call at a time, one absent invitation at a time, one younger man at a time who stopped lowering his eyes. And here is the part of it that I find, after all these years and all these stories, the hardest to sit with, not because it's brutal, but because it's so quiet. The host was never punished for what he tried to do. No one ever named it. No one ever stood up in any hall and said you tried to have a man killed. There was no reckoning, no confrontation, no scene. The thing he'd done in that room simply went unspoken, by everyone, forever, which meant he had to carry it entirely alone. He didn't even get the relief of being accused. He got the worst thing. He got 100 men who knew, and said nothing, and slowly, politely, year by year, stopped including him in the world he'd spent his life building. They say, and this is one of the thinnest threads in the whole record, a single account, told late, so take it as the candlelight it is rather than the daylight. They say that in his last years the host had become a small man in a large house. Still wealthy. Still, on paper, a person of standing. But alone in the way that matters. The deference gone. The rooms he walked into no longer rearranging themselves around him. And they say that once, near the end, an old acquaintance, one of the few who still came around, made the mistake of mentioning that night. Not directly, just a glancing reference. That demonstration years ago with the young teacher. And the host, who had spent decades not speaking of it, was quiet for a long time. And then he said only one thing. He said, "I have never met a calmer man." That's all. No regret you could quote. No confession. Just that. I have never met a calmer man. The single sentence of a man who had spent the rest of his life turning one evening over in his hands, looking for the place where it had gone wrong, and finding, every time, the same answer, that he had built a perfect room to break a man, and the man had simply declined to break, and had been calm about declining. And that calm had been the one thing in the whole world the host's money, and standing and patience could not touch. He had brought 100 men to watch a young teacher be made small. And he had spent the rest of his life being the smallest man in that memory. That's the emotional weight I want you to carry out of his part of the story, bro, and I want to be careful with it, because it would be easy to make it triumphant, and it isn't, quite. There's no joy in it. There's something heavier than joy. There's the plain fact that the host destroyed himself, not in a single dramatic stroke, but slowly, with his own hands, over years, in the privacy of a memory he could never put down. Bruce Lee never lifted a finger against him. Bruce Lee walked out of that hall and, by every account, almost never spoke of him again. The young man went on to a life so large the whole world would eventually carry it in its chest. And the host stayed behind in that room, for the rest of his life, long after everyone else had gone home. Some men you don't have to beat. You just have to be calm in front of them, once, completely, on the worst night they ever planned, and then walk out the door and let them spend the rest of their lives in the room they built. Now I'm going to take off the storyteller's hat and put on the other one, the one I've worn on mats and hard floors for 30-some years, and I'm going to tell you what actually happened in that hall. The mechanics, the psychology, and the line between what's true and what the legend added later. Because you deserve all three, and because the truth, in this case, is better than the legend, and that's rare. First, the mechanics. How does a 138-pound man put down a 240-pound man with a touch? He doesn't. Not the way the legend tells it. There's no magic touch, no mystical energy, no secret pressure point that drops a giant like a switch. I want to be honest with you about that, because the truth is more useful than the fairy tale, and you can actually take the truth home and use it. What Bruce did was simpler and far harder than magic. He used the big man's own commitment against him. Here's the principle, and it's real, and any good grappler or any honest striker will confirm it. A large man's strength is only an advantage while his structure is intact. The moment his weight is committed in a direction, a lunge, a punch, a reach, there is a fraction of a second where his power is traveling, and during that fraction, his base is compromised. His feet are between positions. His weight is past his balance point. And in that window, it takes almost no force to redirect him, because you're not fighting his 240 pounds. You're adding to it, in a direction he can't recover from. That's what the touch was. It wasn't force. It was timing. Bruce read the exact instant the big man's weight committed, and he applied a small redirection at the one point in the chain, the wrist, the elbow, the spot below the collarbone, where a small redirection becomes a large result. The big man's momentum did the rest. He didn't get knocked down. He got steered into the floor, using the engine he'd revved himself. This is the most important thing I can teach you out of this whole story, and it's true off the mat as much as on it. You don't beat a stronger force by being stronger. You beat it by being there at the exact moment its strength is committed, and adding a little nudge it can't take back. That's not mysticism. That's leverage and timing, and it's available to anyone willing to put in the 10,000 quiet hours. Second, the psychology. Why didn't he break? This is the part that matters more than the mechanics, and it's the part almost nobody trains. The host's entire plan depended on one assumption, that under enough pressure, Bruce's mind would shut off and his fear or his anger would take over. Because that's how the overwhelming majority of human beings work. Pressure floods the system. The thinking brain goes offline. The animal takes the wheel, and the animal either freezes, flees, or explodes, all three of which were exactly what the room was built to exploit. Bruce had trained the one thing that beats that, and it's not toughness, and it's not aggression. It's attention. He had built, over years, the capacity to stay in the thinking, observing, mapping part of his mind even while his body was under maximum threat. That's why, while 3 fighters came at him, he was counting the men by the wall. That's why he saw the bolted door, the heavy coats, the host's hand. The pressure that was supposed to switch his mind off had been trained, in him, to switch it on. And here's the deeper psychological move, the one the host never saw coming. Bruce understood that in a room built to make him small, the most powerful thing he could do was get smaller on the inside. Quieter. Stiller. He didn't meet the room's heat with more heat. He met it with cold. And cold, in a room full of men who came to feed on a frightened or furious young man, gave them nothing to feed on. The room needed his reaction to complete itself. He starved it. They built a room to make me small, so I made myself quiet, and the room did the rest. That's not just a nice line. That's the actual psychological mechanism. A trap built around your reaction dies when you decline to react. Third, and I owe you this, the truth versus the legend. Here's where I have to be a straight man with you. The records of this night are thin. They're real, but they're thin, and they were assembled out of fragments. A sentence here, a deathbed half-confession there, a fighter's lifelong limp, a host's one quiet line near the end. So I'm going to tell you what I'm confident is true, and what I think the legend added, and let you hold them in your own 2 hands. What's true, I'm confident, is the shape of it, a young teacher, resented by the old guard for opening the art to everyone, an invitation that was a trap, a room built to break or remove him, and a young man who read the trap, refused every role it offered him, and walked out under his own power without ever throwing a punch in anger. That shape is consistent across every fragment, and it's consistent with everything we know about the man's character for the rest of his life. He really did teach anyone. He really did refuse the wall. He really did, again and again, decline to be put back in any place anyone assigned him. What the legend added is the cinema. The men flying across the room. The single mystical touch. The dialogue polished to a movie shine. The exact body count on the platform. Those details grew in the retelling, the way they always do, because a true story about attention and stillness is hard to act out at a dinner table, and a story about a small man throwing giants is easy. So the giants got thrown. The touch got magic. The truth, which was quieter and harder and better, got dressed up to survive the journey. And here's the thing I want to leave you with. The reason I told you the quiet version all the way through. The legend makes you want to be Bruce Lee. The truth makes you able to learn from him. The legend says, be born with a magic touch. The truth says, train your attention until it doesn't desert you under pressure. Understand that strength is only an advantage while it's committed, and refuse, completely, to play the part the room has cast you in. Those three things are not magic. Those three things are available to you, and to me, on a Tuesday, in whatever hall someone decides to build around us. The coda. So that's the night, bro. 100 men came to watch a young teacher fall, and instead they watched a host fall slowly for the rest of his life. The platform was the show. The room was the trap. And the dangerous man, like always, was never the one on the boards under the lights. He was the quiet one in the front row in the good suit, who never threw a punch, and somehow there was blood on the floor when he left. Except this time, there wasn't. This time the one man who could have made blood chose, very specifically, not to, and walked out into the cold air carrying nothing but a lesson, and left every other man in that hall carrying a memory they'd spend their lives trying to set down. Remember the 4 men by the door. Remember the 5th man who never stood up at all. Remember that the host's plan died not when a fighter went down, but when a young man got calm. And remember the host's last line, because it's the whole story folded into 6 words by the one man qualified to judge it. I have never met a calmer man. The seed? But here's the question I'm leaving you with, the one that opens the next door, because that night raised something the records only whisper about, and I want to sit in it with you next time. The host never named what he'd done. 100 men knew, and not one ever said it out loud. There was a kind of justice in that hall that night, but it was a silent justice, a justice with no verdict, no accusation, no reckoning anyone could point to. The host wasn't punished. He was abandoned. And I've come to wonder, after all these years, is that justice at all? Or is it something colder, a community agreeing, all at once, to look away from what it had nearly done, and to let one man carry the weight of it alone, in silence, forever? Because somewhere in that city, in the years after, there was a second room, a quieter one, with different men in it. And what happened there, what the silence of that first hall set in motion, is the story I want to tell you next time. Stick around, bro. The lamps aren't off yet.